All right, well, welcome everybody to the last lecture of History of Medicine Epidemics. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. So we're going to be talking about the obesity epidemic as well as wellness movements. And it's a little bit different today because we're talking about diseases that aren't really communicable, whereas all the other diseases we've talked about have been communicable diseases caused by microorganisms, whereas obesity is a little bit different. So before we really get started, I want to talk about the term obesity because I don't really like this term. And I think a lot of people don't really like this term. To kind of give some history on the term obesity, it originates from the 16th century. So that's the first time this term is used in the literature. And it's roughly translated from a Latin phrase, having eaten until fat. And I think where the criticism comes from or comes to this term is because it really only focuses on one of many different factors that influence body weight. There are a lot of different things that influence people's proclivity to put on body fat. Things like activity and food consumption. So obesity, that term seems to encompass the food consumption part, but not really activity levels. It doesn't encompass genetics, endocrine factors, health conditions, and epigenetics that really have a big influence in how much proclivity somebody has to put on body fat. I think we all can think of at least one person who eats a ton of food and is super thin and lanky, and then other people who maybe don't eat a lot, but still tend to put on a lot of body fat. So genetics and endocrine regulation do have a um, high impact on overall body size. Stress and emotional factors are really important for determining body size, as well as medications. Things like corticosteroids and insulin can really influence people's propensity to put on body weight, and environmental factors too, and socioeconomics can influence it. So I'm going to continue to use the term obesity because that is kind of a clinical designation for people who are over BMI of 30, although we'll talk about some issues with BMI also later on. But just kind of keep in the back of your mind that this term, it doesn't really encompass everything that could influence people's body weight. So what about body size in the historical record? Well, kind of going back into, for look at archaeological evidence, for most of history, we have really limited evidence for body sizes, and there are a few different reasons for this. First of all, if you're looking at the archaeological record, soft tissues are rarely preserved. So we only have bones for most individuals, with the exceptions being some kind of mummies. But yeah, really we just have bones. So we don't know how much fat or muscle mass, things like that, people may have had in the past. Also, if you're just looking at artwork to kind of figure out how many people maybe were in larger bodies or smaller bodies, that's not a good representation either, because art usually represents an idealized body form, usually people who were having portraits painted of themselves, or pictures of themselves kind of memorialized, were going to have these kind of idealized representations. Whatever was culturally considered most beautiful, that's how they would want themselves to be represented in that artwork. So art is not necessarily realism. It is probable that larger body size with abundant body fat may have been present at least 50,000 years ago. And the reason that we think that is because of these little Venus figurines that have been kind of dug up from Europe and Central Asia, going back to about 50,000 years ago. So these little Venus figurines you can see on the right side of the screen, these two are from about 30,000 to 20,000 years ago. The one on the left is called the Venus of Willendorf, and this is one of my favorite ones. But what you can see with these figurines is that these individuals, all these Venus figurines are, they show female body forms, but you can see that they have a lot of body fat. They have belly rolls, they have thigh rolls, they tend to have really large breasts. And what's also obvious from looking at these is that the people who carved these must have known what a larger body size looked like with abundant body fat, because You can see these kind of belly rolls and thigh rolls. So there was some diversity in body size, at least going back 50,000 years ago, if not even longer in human history. And we know that some degree of body size variation has probably existed in almost every society, every human society, except those maybe living in very extreme environments. So if you look down here, this is a Guatemalan carving. I believe it's Olmec, going back to about 700 AD. And you can see this is like a man in with larger body size, and he's actually talking to a frog on the right side of this carving, which is kind of fun. So again, there was diversity in body size. It's just not always represented in art. So thinking about body ideals, a lot of the body ideals that we do have a record of in historical context are from the Renaissance, because a lot of people were painting in the Renaissance, and particularly there were a lot of nude paintings in the Renaissance. So we just get a kind of a record of what this idealized body form in the Renaissance was. And so people like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Botticelli were all painting and sculpting at this time. And their body size ideals were really more focused on the perfect male form rather than the perfect female form. They were really looking at Plato's Golden Rule and the Vitruvian man as the kind of description of that perfect body form. And they reflected classical body standards for men. And what I mean by classical body standards is going back to kind of the ancient Greek times, ancient Roman times. So if you kind of think about those Greek and Roman statues, what you'll notice is the men typically are going to have, they're usually muscular, but not overly muscular. And the idea was that you wanted to have a balance. So you wanted to be muscular enough to show that you were physically active, but not so muscular that it seemed like you were abandoning your duties in scholarly work. You wanted to show that you weren't overly vain also. So there was this kind of strict set of proportions outlined for what the ideal manly body form would be, with an emphasis on muscularity and intelligence. And interestingly, through those classical times and through the Renaissance, body form in women was a lot less restricted during this time period. So you see a lot more diversity in body size in these paintings of women compared to paintings of men. Usually female body form was focused on softness and fertility, and you actually see a lot of women depicted with pretty good amount of body fat, and that was usually a signifier that you were wealthy enough to be able to afford a lot of food and not have to do a lot of physical activity. So body fat indicated wealth and health. So just kind of thinking also about Da Vinci and his influence on masculine body ideals. If you look at the Vitruvian man over on the left side of the screen, I'm sure everyone's probably seen this before, but this outlined a set of very strict ratios to indicate what the best, most ideal manly form of body was. And these ideals really did and still do persist in art in a lot of different ways. So you can kind of read some of these descriptions on the right side of the screen. Again, everything was kind of divided up into ratios of the height or length. So it really isn't until the late 1800s that we start seeing an emphasis placed on body weight rather than body proportions. And a big reason for that is because scales that measure people's body weights weren't publicly really readily available until the late 1800s. So if you think about the history of the scale, for most of human history, the only types of scales that existed were balance scales. So if you've ever seen outside of a courthouse, the blind justice holding the scales that kind of balance, those were the kinds of scales that were available. And those are good for measuring things like grain, something like that, but not really good for measuring humans. We don't really start measuring human body weight until I think it's the late 1700s, the first spring scale was invented. But even then, in the late 1700s, the spring scales were very expensive. They were exclusively found in physicians' offices, particularly in very wealthy areas. So they weren't really readily available. You couldn't just go weigh yourself if you were kind of the average Joe. The turning point came in the late 1800s in Germany. Penny scales began being developed, and they became really popular in the US during the 1890s. And these penny scales would be found kind of all over the place in shops, in markets, and you could actually pay 1 penny to find out what your body weight was. And this was really the first commercial body weight measure. So previously, people could only be weighed by a doctor, and really only if your doctor happened to have a scale. During the first few years of the availability of these penny scales, an estimated 10 billion pennies per year were collected. So a lot of people were weighing themselves using these things. And it gave the public an opportunity to collect some data about their bodies in a way that they hadn't previously been able to. And it also seemed to usher in a paradigm shift. So previously, people were more concerned about body proportions, making sure that ratios, so for example, from waist to hips or some waist to shoulders were specific ratios, whereas now people were more focused on looking at body weight as an indicator of health and beauty. So kind of moving on to body mass index, because I mentioned earlier there are some issues with this. So let's kind of look at the history of BMI as a tool for measuring data points about health. So body mass index was actually developed by a researcher, I'm going to probably butcher his name, Adolf Quetelet, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his last name, in the 1830s. And he was interested in social physics. So he noticed that sciences in Europe were booming at this time, and he wanted to apply some of these kind of measures and rules that people were applying to the natural world to populations of humans. And in a lot of ways, he was doing it in a really racist way, but Professor Fisher will talk about that more in a minute. So he was really trying to introduce statistics to the study of human populations. So body mass is basically one of the things that he came up with, in addition to some other, again, racist ways of kind of classifying humans. He basically came up with body mass index as a way to collect data on variation in human body size within populations. And then this body mass index was then popularized by Ansel Keys. You may have heard of Dr. Keys. He did a lot of research in the 60s and 70s looking at cardiovascular disease and obesity. And he said, and Dr. Quetelet also said, that using BMI was a useful tool for population studies, but inappropriate for individual evaluation. And I always think that's interesting, because now what do? We use BMI for individual evaluation, even though the two people who kind of popularized and developed this index said you shouldn't use it for measuring individual data points. So Professor Fisher, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, so, kind of just expanding a little bit on the great stuff that, you just said, Dr. Moffat. So what I always found really interesting, and I'm also going to probably butcher Quetelet's name, like 3 years of high school French has done nothing for me. I think I can say like omelette du fromage, and that's about it. But what's really, again, kind of interesting about this, guys, is Quetelet was he was a very, very intelligent academic. He did some fantastic studies on astronomy and mathematics, statistics, and sociology, but this man was not a physician. He never studied medicine. If anything, he really built up this whole concept of this sociological kind of idea of his. It was dubbed the le homme moyen, which is, in French, it boils down to the average man, which was really, again, like, his social ideal, which was, of course, a Caucasian man of the 1800s. And so, guys, again, just kind of further adding to this, like we've talked a little bit about this in different classes, especially in dark medicine, when it comes to kind of just scientific racism and things that were really kind of cropping up around this time during the 1800s. So when Darwin, and so I'm going to give you guys just a very like minor crash course in this if you haven't taken, the course last semester when we did this. So basically, when Darwin wrote his book, it was circulated very widely around, about the theories of evolution and all that stuff in, many Western academic circles. And what kind of came out of this was, again, the concept of scientific racism. At that time, people legitimately believed that the races, weren't just separate due to, certain skin tones or, certain, features and, things that we kind of think about now. We associate that, but we actually thought that humans were different species from one another. And of course, we created a hierarchy where naturally, white people were at the top with the other races kind of trickling down for that. And people really latched on, to this idea and everything when it came to not only just justification for why people should allow slavery to exist here in the United States, but this, eventually would kind of lay rise to eugenics and all of, this other stuff. K. he was being a social scientist. He founded the field of anthropometry, where he would which has like a lot of categories and stuff to it, which is pretty much kind of just the study of how I guess skulls and certain like physiological features, again, kind of added to this racial science. One of the big ones is phrenology, and that's that old timey, if you guys have ever, seen like those little like heads like in doctors' offices, or if you've watched Django Unchained, when the villainous character that Leonardo DiCaprio plays and stuff like that, when he shows, the character the skull and there's all the bumps on that. This was kind of this really, it's very much disproven now, idea that the certain bumps in the skull would actually, almost like a fortune teller's palm, tell you certain things about the person. Like if somebody had a bump here, then they were probably a pathological liar. The person had a little dimple here, then that meant, something else. And so again, it's a complete quack science, but Quetelet founded this. So this is where, again, I have tremendous problems with the BMI. And this is just, so many people who know me have heard me say this so many times, it's probably, annoying. But again, the fact that a scientist who had a key in much of this very much disproven and horrible eugenic-y racial science created this before the Civil War to basically be, a tool to embody the perfect guy who happened to be probably a 5'7" Caucasian guy. That is our standard of health that is used in modern medicine today, and it is so absolutely flawed. And again, going on, Ansel Keys, they did the work in the 60s and the 70s and stuff like that really kind of brought this to light and kind of solidified it, in medicine's kind of collective. But BMI has actually been like really horrible in, history, I guess really kind of how it's affected, people of color, anything from like insurance. I mean, like I could seriously kind of spend another 20 minutes just telling you all the bad things this thing has done through the historical record, but it's just not honestly a great tool. And, and again, it baffles me that it's really, what we use in order to prioritize, our idea of what's an acceptable weight and what's not. I will let Dr. Moffat continue. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
No, that was great. Yeah, and I think just going back to that point of people, even the people who developed this tool, which you've established is racist in a lot of ways, is not useful for measuring it doesn't really tell you anything about individual health. It's only useful for looking at variation in a population kind of thing. So I also just wanted to point out that Ansel Keys was not a little known researcher. He was actually on the cover of Time magazine in 1961, and there haven't been that many doctors on the cover of Time magazine. I think there's only been a handful. So he was very well known, and a lot of the reason that we use BMI is because he was using it in his publications. And like Professor Fisher was saying, there are a lot of flaws with BMI, and we can talk about some of these during class time if all of you want, but some of the known flaws that have kind of been picked out in the research is One of them is that BMI doesn't scale isometrically. So basically what that means is for an individual's body height, say if you're shorter versus taller, you could have the same body fat percentage. Say someone at a shorter height has 30% body fat and someone at a taller height is 30% body fat. The person at the taller height will actually have a higher BMI, even though the body fat percentage is exactly the same. And that's because of scaling issues with this ratio. So again, that's one known problem with this. It ignores variables like body frame. So some people just kind of tend to be wider. They tend to have kind of wider chests, kind of bigger thoraxes, bigger abdomens, wider pelvises, and that does have to do with genetics. And BMI doesn't really take that into account. It kind of assumes everyone's kind of like this tall, thin, kind of European framed person, more kind of gracile. It doesn't take into consideration proportions of fat mass, muscle mass, and bone mass. So another kind of problem with it is that most of the people who participated in Quetelet's studies were sedentary. They were white, they were Belgian, they were primarily aristocratic. They were very sedentary people. They didn't have a lot of muscle mass. Their bone mass, I mean, who knows, but they probably weren't getting a lot of exercise, so they may not have had very high bone mass. And so BMI doesn't take into account any of those factors. It just kind of assumes that an increase in BMI is just because of an increase in adiposity or body fat. And there's also an unclear delineation of where the overweight and obese body categories should start. And these have actually changed through time. I think I have some indicators on the next slide. And also people have pointed out that this is not a very good reflection of cardiometric health, and especially in various populations. So I know Professor Fisher, you said this was developed again in white populations. Sometimes some of these kind of health indicators that you see kind of pop up with higher BMI in white populations don't always carry over in non-Caucasian populations. And like I was saying earlier, the cutoff for overweight and obesity have changed through time. So you can kind of see over here. In 1975, the cutoff for overweight was 25 in men and a very low 23.8 in women. In 1985, that was changed again to 26.4 in men and 25.9 in women. In 1990, the cutoff for overweight was changed to, or I think that should say greater than 25 for everyone except for those over 35. And then in 1998, it was changed again to over 25 for everyone. So right now it stands over 25 for everyone is considered overweight, and over 30 would be considered obese. And again, because of those kind of changing categories, you can actually see through time some little jumps in incidence of overweight and obesity. And a lot of sources don't necessarily take that into consideration. So someone who was at a BMI of 26, the day before they changed these guidelines, and then they woke up the next day and they might be in the overweight category because things were just, those categories were just changed. And I was trying to do some reading about the justification for changing these categories in the 90s, and a lot of it had to do with just being able to remember the numbers. It's easy to remember the number 25, it's easy to remember the number 30, so those were considered the cutoffs for overweight and obesity. And I don't know that there's a lot of good clinical data to show that there are different health outcomes at, say, a BMI of 24.5 versus 25.1, but you'd be in a completely different category. So why is there an increase in BMI? There are a lot of different factors that may go into this. So I think the one that everyone kind of clings to is there's been a decrease in exercise and an increase in calorie consumption, or the energy imbalance hypothesis. And I'm not saying there's not anything to this. I think for sure people are probably less active now, and I think that has to do with a lot of people having more kind of sedentary jobs. Not a lot of people, at least in kind of Western societies, do a lot of manual labor, although there are obviously exceptions. Also, food has become more abundant, more, cheaper, more readily available. So there's definitely something going on there. But population is also aging. So BMI tends to, or body fat tends to increase with age. And as the population ages, BMI is obviously going to start going up. So the average BMI of a younger population you would expect to be lower compared to the average BMI of a population that has more older individuals in it. There's also been a big decrease in smoking. So in the 1960s, I think almost 50% of adults in the US smoked, and I think it's down to less than 20% now. And nicotine is actually a really powerful appetite suppressant. So that was part of the advertising campaign for cigarettes, actually, kind of through the early part of this previous century. So you can see on the right side of the screen here, to keep a slender figure, no one can deny, reach for a lucky instead of a sweet. So it was kind of promoting nicotine as this appetite suppressant effect. There's also been an increase in dieting behaviors, and there is some kind of evidence that's coming out that weight cycling, so losing weight and then gaining it back, losing weight and then gaining it back, can actually influence adiposity over time. So individuals who are more likely to kind of crash diet and lose a lot of weight and then gain it back actually end up gaining more weight in the long run. And so that could also have an impact on increasing BMI. Height is also increasing. So height has increased about 4 inches in the past 150 years, the average height. And as we know, or as I said earlier, BMI doesn't scale isometrically. So people at higher, who have a greater height, are more likely to be at a higher BMI. And also, some populations are more genetically susceptible to obesogenic environmental factors. This is also called the thrifty gene hypothesis. I'm not going to go into it too much right now, but another factor that really might be driving this increase in BMI is we're collecting more data on non-white populations. So for a long time, we were really just collecting this data on white populations, and the makeup of Western societies, of Western cultures, is changing a lot. And so obviously BMI is going to change a little bit to accommodate this change in just genetic makeup. Why should we worry about an increase in BMI? Well, an increase in BMI is correlated with things like increased mortality and higher rates of diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, etc. I mean, you all are trained doctors. I don't really have to tell you about all these things. But something I do want to talk about is that an increase in BMI is also associated with weight stigma and decreased access to care. That's the next couple of slides that I'm going to go over with you. So this idea of weight stigma really goes hand in hand with something called healthism. And healthism was an idea that was first developed in the 1980s by a researcher named Crawford. Basically, the gist of the term healthism is that healthism is situating the problem of health and disease at the level of the individual, and solutions are also formulated at that level as well. And I think that especially with the obesity epidemic, a lot of the blame and fault goes on individuals rather than systemic issues like access to healthy foods, ability of people to engage in exercise for recreation, and things like that. So I think that's a really important point to kind of keep in mind here. Healthism also, again, you're situating the problem and the solution at the level of the individual, and it doesn't really acknowledge any factors outside of an individual's control, like their genetics, their endocrine functions, that could control and affect those health outcomes as well. And it's placing the burden of maintaining health only on your individual choices. Obesity is increasingly blamed on individual decisions, and negative attitudes towards large body size is still prevalent in US culture, including medicine for sure. So also there was kind of a series of interesting studies done in the 80s, and it basically looked at individuals with stigmatizing conditions, such as drug addiction and obesity, basically factors that people perceived as being due to an individual's control. And those stigmatizing conditions evoke a lot more anger compared to other conditions. And I think that you still see that a lot, not only just in medicine, but in kind of US culture as a whole. I think people get very angry. They often see obesity as something that's entirely within an individual's control, and they should just, if they're not doing anything about it, then, you know, they're not worth your time. Weight stigma is also associated with poor mental and physical health outcomes. So a lot of times I feel like people in larger bodies feel some stigma from physicians, and they might be less likely to go to the doctor due to fears of being stigmatized, fears of being told, oh, well, everything that you're complaining about is only due to your weight. So there's not really anything we can do for you unless you lose weight. So a lot of people in larger bodies do report going to the doctor less frequently or waiting longer to go to the doctor for something that might not be a big issue at the time, but then can become a bigger issue if they wait a longer time. And I think weight stigma and fat phobia really remain a socially acceptable form of bias. I think kind of in the public sphere, it's not okay to be racist, it's not okay to be sexist, and I definitely see people calling others out for those kind of attitudes. But people who are fat phobic or making jokes about people in larger bodies, those people don't usually get called out. And I think it definitely is socially acceptable to kind of hold those views. There's also been a globalization of weight stigma. So a lot of research indicates that traditionally fat positive societies that valued larger body size or who saw greater adiposity as something beautiful have increasingly negative attitudes towards large body size. So this is kind of where health at every size comes in. Health at every size, I wanted to talk a little bit about it because I feel like it gets, the tenets get kind of skewed in kind of when it gets talked about in the mainstream. So health at every size is something that's kind of been around since the 1960s in various forms, but it really was solidified in the 1990s by someone named Dr. Lindo Bacon. So Dr. Bacon holds a PhD in physiology, a master's in nutrition, and I think also a master's in psychology. So this individual does know what they're talking about. They have done a lot of research. And basically the tenets of health at every size, the purpose is to decrease weight stigma kind of in the health sphere. So the tenets are weight inclusivity, respecting a diversity of body shapes and sizes, and reject the idealizing or pathologizing of specific weights. Enhancing health, so supporting health policies that improve and equalize access to information and services. Eating for well-being, so promoting flexible, individualized eating based on hunger, satiety, nutritional needs, and pleasure, rather than any externally regulated eating plan focused only on weight control. Respectful care, and I think this is a really big one, so acknowledging our biases and working to end weight discrimination, stigma, and bias, because obviously people who are more comfortable going to doctors are going to have better health overall. And life-enhancing movement, supporting physical activities that allow people of all sizes, ages, abilities, and interests to engage in enjoyable movement. So again, the purpose of this movement is to kind of expand access to care to people who might have previously felt stigmatized and not wanting to engage in some of these behaviors. So kind of moving on, the thing that goes hand in hand with the obesity epidemic are historical diets and wellness movements. So people have been trying to lose weight for a lot of human history. And some of these diets are not really anything to write home about. They're pretty, run of the mill, but there are some dangerous and bizarre diets that have come out of the historical record. So the doctrine of signatures, this is one that I feel like still kind of pops up in modern day times. So it was developed by a botanist named William Coles in the 1650s. He basically said that foods that resemble specific body parts can be used to treat diseases of those body parts. So this is, funnily enough, why oysters and mussels were thought to be aphrodisiacs. I'm not going to explain that one to you. You'll just have to figure it out on your own.
I'm giggling like a 12-year-old in the background.
I know. So basically the idea was that God put signatures into these foods to give humans hints into their usefulness. And though these ideas have been disproven over and over again, they do still pop up in modern popular science health sources. So just a quick Google search showed me this from WebMD, why are walnuts good for me? And you can see down here, no wonder they're good brain food. They look like little brains. And I think this is one of those ideas that, again, you see over and over again. If something looks like a specific organ, then it's probably good for that. So another famous diet was popularized by George Shane. He was a Scottish physician who developed one of the first vegetarian diets popular in Europe. Obviously, there have been vegetarian diets popular in other cultures for centuries, if not millennia, but this was one of the first popular ones in Europe. So this started as just kind of a run-of-the-mill vegetarian diet that he promoted for weight loss. He attributed his 40-pound weight loss to this diet and started writing books about it. Where it gets kind of weird is later in his life, he started attributing all kinds of magical powers to this diet, saying that it would cure cancer, cure leprosy, epilepsy, melancholy, tuberculosis, and mental illness. And I think I always like including this one because I feel like this is the same thing that kind of happens with modern diets too. It's like, first of all, it starts off being really good for weight loss, and then you start getting all these kind of outlandish and unsupported claims about, oh, if you just, eat the keto diet, you won't get dementia and, you won't get cancer and those kinds of things. Since we're on the topic of the keto diet was not the first low carb diet. It wasn't even really the second low carb diet. So the very first low carb diet that was popularized in Europe was due to an undertaker named Dr. William Banting. He went on a low carb diet. He didn't call it that, but essentially it was a low carb diet. It was mostly meat and vegetables. And in 1863, he wrote what he called the Letter on Corpulence, which he published and then gained popularity throughout England. Again, he was an undertaker, and he was a pretty famous undertaker. He directed the funerals of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. So he was, very wealthy and kind of part of that British aristocracy. So where we get kind of a shift in these diets is when we start learning about calories and nutrients. So before the mid 1800s, it was more avoid specific types of food. So either avoid meat or avoid starchy things like potatoes or rice or bread or beer or whatever. Whereas after the mid 1800s, we start focusing on calories and nutrients. The reason for that is there were some new technological advances in the mid 1800s. So nutritional thermodynamics became a field of study. You also have, so basically with nutritional thermodynamics, you could put your substance or food within this calorimeter, which you can see on the right side of the screen, and basically burn it up. And however much energy it took to burn up that food was how many calories were in it. So you could quantify food into these individual calories. Also in the mid 1800s, people started identifying macronutrients like carbohydrates, protein, and fat, as well as micronutrients within food. And this prompted inquiries into deficiency disorders like goiter and rickets. So again, mid 1800s, we start learning about the kind of components of food. And so research starts to shift in this way. So Arthur Hill Hassel, I don't want to say too much about him, but he was really instrumental in kind of promoting food safety in the mid 1800s. So he was I don't want to say a hypochondriac, but he might have been a little bit of a hypochondriac. He was very convinced that London's food supply was being adulterated with additives. And in some ways, he was right. So some things like coffee were kind of being filled with wood shavings. People were kind of adding these non-nutritional additives into food to make them cheaper and easier to produce. So he started doing an investigation into all these kind of the seedy underside of the food production world. He published his findings in the Lancet, and this really set off people in England because they thought that their food was being tampered with, their food wasn't pure. So in 1860, the Food Adulteration Act was passed in the UK. This basically set out guidelines for acceptable standards for food that came in packages. And in 1881, Arthur Hill Hassell founded the Pure Food Company. And this is, again, where he starts to go off the deep end. I feel like people, especially in kind of this nutrition world, they kind of start off, doing things that might promote health, and then they start really going off the deep end to think some maybe kind of crazy things. So he, in his later life, became really paranoid about the food supply. He thought everything was tainted, everything was being adulterated. So he founded his own food company to combat this. He marketed things that today sound really disgusting, like purest beef jelly and fibrinous meat lozenges. I'm not even sure what that would be.
Meat lozenges. That's just
lozenge of meat. But the reason that he is historically significant is this Pure Food Company actually was the inspiration for other big brands that we think of today, like Nestle and Cadbury. They actually started in response to this panic over the purity of the food supply. Another weird one is the tapeworm diet. I'm sure everyone's probably heard of someone jokingly say that they're going to eat a tapeworm to lose weight, but this actually was a real thing. And I think you probably still can buy tapeworms on the internet. I don't know, but I don't recommend it. But this was popularized in the early 1900s with the advent of ladies magazines. So ladies magazines started coming out kind of in the Victorian era, and they basically told you what you needed to do a proper lady. And this is actually the time in history when diets start being marketed to women. Before these ladies magazines, diets were actually seen as the realm of men. So if you actually look at some of those diets we talked about before, the Banting diet and George Shane's diet, these were by men for men. And with the advent of these ladies magazines, it was like, oh no, women need to be dieting too. You need to be worried about your figure. To be a proper lady, you need to show restraint and restriction in the kinds of foods you eat. One of the weird ones that came out of these magazines was this tapeworm diet. So basically you would send away for a package, a little packet that had tapeworm eggs inside of it. You would take these pills that had tapeworm eggs, wait for them to hatch. The problem was, other than, you're eating tapeworm eggs, is how to get rid of the tapeworms after you had them. So, okay, you took the tapeworms, you ate them, and then you lost X amount of pounds, however much you wanted to. How do you get rid of these tapeworms? Well, there were a few different ways. The most interesting one that I saw was you would take a little glass tube with a piece of apple or some kind of tasty morsel in it, and you'd have to either insert it rectally or orally into the GI tract and just wait for the tapeworm to latch on to that little morsel and then pull the tube out. So yeah, kind of gross.
Anytime people tell me history is boring and stuff like that, but it's like, no, you can't come up with this kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, this is another one too. So Linda Burfield Hazard. I wanted to talk about her because I feel like fasting is becoming really popularized these days as a way to lose weight. And again, not the first time in history we've seen this. So Linda Hazard in 1908 published a book called Fasting for the Cure of Disease. You can still read it on Google Books if you want to. I don't recommend it. It's kind of weird. But she set up a clinic in Wilderness Heights, which was in Washington State. Basically, there was a loophole in Washington State at the time that if you called yourself a doctor of alternative medicine, you didn't have to have a medical license. You could just set up shop and call yourself a doctor. So she called herself a doctor. I believe she called herself an osteopath, but she didn't actually have a medical license or a degree. At this clinic, she had a series of treatments, all that kind of revolved around fasting. So you could have broth 2 times per day. You would get daily massages, which kind of sound more like beatings. And the purpose of these was to kind of move your internal organs around to help speed up digestion. You would get hours-long baths and hours-long enemas, which sounds just totally awful. She claimed that fasting was totally, completely safe. No need to worry because lots of religions promote fasting. So you can just fast as much as you want. There should be no ill side effects. She also had this weird belief that all food was poison and all diseases were the result of an overworked digestive system. And I think this also gets kind of echoed in some of the kind of the weird alternative wellness circles today too. People talk about fasting not only as a way to lose weight, but as a way to get healthy. You can like shrink your tumors if you fast for long enough. I hear weird things like that all the time. Dr. Hazard's, Linda Hazard's downfall had to do with, well, she started getting a lot more popular. And so a lot of socialites and well-to-do people started coming to her clinic. 2 that really led to her downfall were Claire and Dora Williamson. So these were 2 sisters who came to Wilderness Heights to get some of Linda Hazard's treatments. Claire actually died while she was undergoing an extended fast with Linda Hazard. And Claire's family actually came to Wilderness Heights to help pick up Dora because they were concerned about her. At this point, Dora actually didn't want to leave. And you can see what she actually looked like when they came to pick her up. From Wilderness Heights on the right side there. And if you look on the left side of the screen, Dora, I think, is in the middle there. So you can see there was quite a change from when she first went to Wilderness Heights versus when she left. She had lost a significant amount of weight. After they came in, Dora's family came and rescued her, some investigations were done and it was found that 14 deaths were actually attributed to Linda Hazard's treatment. She killed 14 of her patients just at this Wilderness Heights facility. She was briefly arrested, although she got out on parole for good behavior after a few years. And she actually began practicing again. So she kind of moved around to different places and would set up clinics until she got run out of town. She, even after killing 14 patients, refused to believe that it was fasting that actually did any of this. She thought it was just maybe they had a weak constitution or something else was going on. And interestingly enough, Linda Hazard herself died while fasting in 1938 when she was on one of these extended fasts.
Yeah, no, she actually, I think after the whole Washington stint, she, I think, ran away to New Zealand, so the story goes, and various sources have kind of said various things, but because Australia and New Zealand had much more lax laws, like it's estimated that she just started right back up. They credit her to killing another 20 to 200 like people.
Wow.
So she is like considered like actually a pretty prolific serial killer in some circles. But it's the whole thing that you don't, because she would also like lie about their death certificates, and she would just kind of like, because she was the doctor, she could just put what she wanted on there. She also like kind of manipulated it. So with a lot of these socialites, she got like their money, or she changed their power of attorney and did all of that stuff too. But yeah, no, she's a fascinating creature, just because like she bought into it, but at the same time she did such fiendish and shystery stuff that you don't quite know where like the illusion and stuff like ended, and how much of it was like a scheme versus, because yeah, as you put it, she got sick and she was going to prove to the world that her stuff was going to work, so she ended up killing herself trying to cure the common cold by fasting. Anyways,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, it's an interesting aside. I didn't realize that she killed that many more people after she moved to New Zealand. I knew that she'd moved around.
Well, it's
New
because she
Zealand,
moved around. Yes, she had like about 5 or 6 clinics after that, and that's why
right.
the body count really kind of varies. Kind of like with other doctors, serial killers like H.H. Holmes, like they think that it's a ballpark, but they have like no real way to kind of 100% tally how many there might have
Mhm.
been.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that with a lot of the socialites, she was kind of rewriting their wills, or maybe having them rewrite their wills under some, duress, because one of the stories is that when Dora Williamson's family came to pick her up, they saw that um, Linda Hazard was wearing one of Claire's dresses. So Claire was the sister who had died. So I mean, who knows if that's actually true, but it's a good story, right?
Right. No, no, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. And I've kind of heard similarly that like Claire tried to get out and she tried to like bribe the postman before she died and stuff like that because she wasn't as brainwashed as Dora was. But
Mhm.
unfortunately she succumbed like beforehand. And it was just like there was extensive just manipulation going on Linda Hazard's end to really like get people to buy not only into the program mentally, but to pony up, their riches to help like fund her program.
Right. Anyway, so there's so much to talk about with Linda Hazard, but to kind of point out a couple of other kind of interesting characters around this time, Horace Fletcher is another one. So he was another kind of well-to-do gentleman. His big shtick was you should chew food fully till it was liquefied before swallowing your food. Even liquids, if you were drinking water, you should chew it before swallowing. Um, his nickname, which is pretty funny, is the Great Masticator. And he had a tagline that he would always say, something along the lines of nature will castigate those who don't masticate. So he really thought that if you didn't chew, you were going to just, die some horrible death. He had a clinic that he set up in Venice, and this clinic was really ritzy. So it was actually a big palazzo, and he invited the rich and famous to come to his clinic to learn his techniques. And he, again, was not really a fringe figure. So Mark Twain, John D. Rockefeller, and Upton Sinclair, these were all really wealthy, famous people, all came to Venice to try his new diet. His ideas were, again, really kind of strange. So with that fully chewing food, you'd get this superhuman strength, and he would often, or at least the stories go, that after eating a meal where he would fully chew his food, he would show off how strong he was by kind of like running around the dining room and doing push-ups and lifting weights, and just to show his guests how strong he was. He also thought protein is dangerous, and might seem like a weird fringe idea, but actually this was a pretty popular idea around this time. And we'll talk about the Kellogg brothers in just a minute. So a lot of people at this time thought protein was the most dangerous of all the micronutrients. So
Protein is like today what carbs are now.
yeah, pretty much. And another weird thing he thought was that you should examine every single bowel movement to make sure that you had chewed your food properly. So if you did chew your food properly, the feces should be basically completely liquid. It should have no smell, and it should have no signs of decomposition. So kind of going along with that weird idea that protein is dangerous, we're going to go over to the Kellogg brothers. So John and Will Kellogg, and this is the same, yes, the Frosted Flakes Kellogg's. These were two brothers who were both extremely spiritual, and they kind of went around dabbling in various religions. What really changed everything is when John joined the Seventh-day Adventists, and he believed that the second coming of Christ was imminent, and that he needed to purify his body and help other people purify their bodies to kind of make way for the second coming of Christ. So his ideas, again, this idea that protein is dangerous, and he developed this line of carbohydrate-rich foods for patients. So the corn flakes that we think of as kind of the breakfast cereal, and a lot of people, nowadays think breakfast cereal is so unhealthy, but back in the day, it was considered to be extremely healthy because it was very low protein. He also believed in a vegetarian diet because in his view, meat consumption causes lust and masturbation. He interestingly was a really early proponent of germ theory. And he also had this interesting idea, which turned out later to be correct, that there were microorganisms living in people's guts, and you could change these microorganisms based on what you're eating. And we actually know that that's true today. So he had some interesting kind of before his time ideas, and then some that were maybe not so good. But the reason that I bring it up is he had this Battle Creek Sanitarium, which is a very state-of-the-art facility that he would invite people to. It opened in 1907, and he had some really notable patients. So Warren G. Harding, the President Warren G. Harding, Sojourner Truth, Amelia Earhart, and Henry Ford all came to his clinic. And he promoted there something he called biologic living. So I kind of like to think of this as kind of like a weird camp for people who are really interested in health and wellness. It's kind of like Goop or one of those Gwyneth Paltrow like resort things. I don't know. But basically people would come there, and the idea started off kind of nice. So, okay, you would have a healthy diet, you do some exercise, you would have some recreation, and that would promote a healthy patient. I think everybody can kind of get on board with that one. Alcohol, tobacco, caffeine should be avoided. Okay, that's, probably good advice for most people. All condiments should be avoided because you don't want your food to have any flavor. And this is where things start going off the deep end. All sexual activity is dangerous. And then this last one is okay, masturbation causes cancer, epilepsy, mental illness, blindness, and urinary incontinence. So yeah, I don't know where he got that, but
That's my grandma all over again, except for like they forgot the hairy knuckles part.
Yep. Might have been in there too. Who knows? So kind of going on. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, so sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Moffat.
No.
Just completely silly, guys. But I always like disclaim, like when we get to do this lecture in person, there is a drunk history episode of the Kellogg Brothers, which has Luke and oh my god, I'm blanking on the other brother, Owen Wilson. Thank you. Yeah. Luke and Owen Wilson. That was it. Got it. On it, and it's probably one of the funniest drunk history segments like ever. So that's one of those things that we can't exactly like assign to you guys just because. But if you really just do want to see like a very fun historical portrayal of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, I very much recommend it. I think you guys can find it streaming on like Comedy Central. All right, moving forward.
I actually haven't seen that one, so I might have to go look that up after we're done here.
That and like the David Inouye one are probably like hands down like the best ones I've seen. And drunk history is pretty fun in general.
So just kind of thinking about other diet fads, because I want people to think about the cyclical nature of these diets and where we get a lot of diety and wellnessy ideas that persist even to this day. So in the 1930s, the grapefruit diet was a really popular one. And I think that's where we kind of get this idea of grapefruits being a diet food today. I can remember my grandmother, every time she was on a diet, she wanted us to go get grapefruits for her because I don't know what kind of magical properties grapefruits supposedly had, but that was always the thing. The cabbage soup diet was another one. So this was kind of a weird one that relied on food combining principles. So you can see it over on the right side of the screen. Each day you had to combine specific types of foods. And by combining those specific types of foods, you would lose weight after this 1 week of the diet. The alkaline diet's another one that I think still kind of persists in some kind of weird wellnessy circles today. So this one was one that was popularized in the 1960s. And that the tenets were that you should only eat foods that are alkalizing for the body. And I feel like, again, it comes up over and over again, even at like Whole Foods and stuff, you can buy like alkaline water and alkalizing powders and things like that. So I'm not sure if there's any scientific evidence for this one. I don't think that there is. The Atkins diet, so not to pick on keto again, but keto diet is not the first low carb diet. The Atkins diet, really keto is kind of the first phase of the Atkins diet, but with the Atkins diet, it was like you were never supposed to be on this kind of really low carb diet forever, because even Dr. Atkins himself said, it's not realistic for people to be on that low carb of a diet for the rest of their lives. So we've got to incorporate some carbs back in towards the end of the diet. So again, Atkins was a very popular low carb diet in the 80s. Also in the 80s, we get the kind of precursor of the paleo diet called the caveman diet. I could go on for hours about how I feel about the paleo diet. Maybe I'll go on to that diatribe during our class discussion. I'm not going to go on it today, but yeah. So anyway, eat like a caveman was kind of the tagline for that one. And then at least, I don't know how much the students will remember this one, but I definitely very vividly remember the low fat diet of the 90s. Everything had to be low fat chips, low fat cookies. And as long as it said low fat on the bag, you could eat as much as you wanted because it was okay.
Didn't matter if it had like, 200 grams of sugar in it. It was low fat.
Yeah, it was low fat. It was fine. And just to kind of point out that we're making fun of all these historical diets, but I don't think we've actually come that far. So I just did a quick Google search of clean eating, and I came up with all these things I should remove from my diet: sugar, grains, vegetable oil, gluten, legumes, alcohol. I'm not going to read this whole list to you, but basically I'm not sure what I'm supposed to eat after reading this list. Maybe just some like green vegetables. And also kind of doing some Googling of people who are really popular in kind of wellness spheres like Gwyneth Paltrow. So she has this kind of laundry list of foods you shouldn't eat also. Again, I don't think we've really come that far, but maybe we can do some debating about this. And
What are nightshades? I feel like I might have asked this question before, but like I don't like ingest.
It's a specific like group of veg or fruits, maybe like peppers and tomatoes, I think, are part of that group. So
Mexican.
I'm not sure what the beef is with those.
That's just not right.
Yeah.
Take my peppers from my cold dead hands.
Okay, and just kind of a little aside on eating disorders, because I feel like we need to talk about this if we're talking about all these really restrictive eating plans. Eating disorders were considered pretty rare until the 20th century. Some researchers had kind of written about them prior to that, but they were considered to be kind of more fringe practices. So anorexia actually was first described in the literature as a practice of ascetics, so very devout monks and nuns would eat as little as possible. And anorexia was actually considered an endocrine disorder in the early 20th century. But actually by the 1970s, cases had increased so much that physicians started recognizing this as a problem, and anorexia was added to the DSM in 1980. And today it's estimated that it affects about 5% of adolescent girls. I think it's not doing too well in adolescent boys either. So it's pretty high percentage, I think like 2 to 3% of adolescent boys now. And anorexia is really scary because it has an 18 to 20% mortality rate within the first 10 years of the onset of symptoms. So this is something that really needs to be taken very seriously. The third most common chronic illness among adolescents. And then bulimia was first described in the Middle Ages among the wealthy. So it was actually considered to be something that you did if you were extremely wealthy. You would actually induce vomiting so that you could continue eating at these kind of prolonged, very fancy dinner parties. But bulimia was also considered to be extremely rare in the early 20th century, but by 1980, it affected about 3% of girls and women. So today it affects about 5% of adolescent girls and has a 4% mortality rate. And the reason that I kind of bring it up is because the Alliance for Eating Disorder Awareness put out a survey to physicians to ask them how comfortable they felt identifying eating disorder symptoms or recommending professional help. And 80% of physicians said they actually were not comfortable recognizing those symptoms or recommending professional treatment for suspected disorders, which I think is a big oversight considering how large of a percent of the population these disorders affect. And relapse rates for eating disorders, even among people who are recovering, are 30 to 50%. So this is something that's really scary, and I think we should probably talk about it during our class discussion.
Do you know
So
if,
that's, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just gonna ask, do you know if orthorexia has been kind of put into the DSM? Because that's kind of the other one, the whole obsession of like healthy and like eating. And that almost has like a weird like Munchausen by proxy thing, because I found that like a lot of mothers actually force that on their children, all those
Yeah,
diets.
so orthorexia hasn't, as far as I know, has not been added to the DSM, at least last that I checked. And it's one of those ones that I feel like will be eventually. But yeah, like you said, it's a kind of an obsession with healthy eating, purity of foods, and kind of a very strict mentality about being able to break those rules around food. So yeah, I think that one's probably pretty common. And I'm wondering if it ever gets added to the DSM, kind of what the prevalence of that would be, because that's something I feel like I see all the time.
Oh, I had a friend of a friend, down the road type of thing. Her ex-husband fed her daughter pancakes, and like she like tried to like force the kid to like vomit. And the kid was like 5 because of like this thing. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's so to me it just seemed like it was fascinating, because that's kind of a niche that we don't think about, but I think is actually kind of um a lot more prominent than, I mean,
Mhm.
I think a lot of this stuff is really important, as you put, just not talked about as much as I think it needs to be. And
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I don't want to get too much into what we'll be talking about in the discussion, but I think a lot of it has to do with, so in the 50s and 60s, we kind of found this smoking gun, not, no pun intended really, but like, so smoking was related to lung cancer, and it was really definitively shown, like, okay, if you smoke, you increase, in chances of having lung cancer. It's obvious that that's a connection. And I think we've been looking for that connection for other things, especially in the nutrition world, like, oh, if you just don't eat sugar, you won't get cancer, or oh, if you just don't eat meat, you won't get cardiovascular disease. And it's turns out that nutrition research is really complicated for a lot of different reasons, and we don't have that kind of data to link any one specific food to specific health outcomes. But yeah, that's kind of a whole other diatribe that we can talk about during the discussion.
right, no, and you're so right. And I think there's never going to really be a perfect diet, just because people are much too varied. And
Mhm. Well, anyway, we've kind of come to the end of the lecture, so I have the discussion questions here, and I'll post them on Teams for you all to look at so you can think about these things. And also, I want to take this time to point out that feel free to disagree with us, because neither Professor Fisher nor I are physicians. So, you may have differing opinions with us. We really want to hear what you all have to say about these things and get your perspective.
heck yeah, we love open dialogue. So, again, we've been saying this the whole class, guys, but you are always welcome, to engage with us, and we can have these type of discussions and never feel like, you can't be open about your feelings when it comes to this.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. And we'll be posting the DSA and practice question or the discussion questions on Teams shortly.